Good afternoon, and welcome to the continuation of the Miller Center's National Fellowship Conference, our spring conference. The National Fellowship Program is a program that brings together some of the very best scholars from around the world. These are people who are finishing their PhD dissertations in political science and history and political sociology, and it combines them with senior scholars, people we call controversial in some camps, dream mentors. It would appear to be that the first obligation of a dream mentor is to deny that they're a dream mentor. But we get past that, and these mentors work with the fellow throughout the fellowship year, work on the literature, read lots of drafts of chapters, and we're just winding that up today. I did want to announce two exciting developments in the fellowship program. We are launching two new fellowships. We currently have 9 fellowships. We're launching 2 new fellowships next year, one in law and politics, where we'll partner with UVA's law school, and one in business and politics, where we'll partner with the Hagley Museum and Library, one of the premier business archives in the world. So spread the word if you know people working in legal history, history of the law, or people working in history of business and politics. This event we called a Manuscript Review. It was suggested by Ira Katznelson about 10 years ago. And he said, you know, it's a great conference, but you need something to tie the room together. Why don't you have a leading scholar come in and present a manuscript in progress and really bring some of the leading scholars and practitioners who can critique that manuscript before it's too late. We've all been there, you know, where our book has come out and you participate in a panel and people always say, you know, you should have done this, you should have done that. Well, today we do have one of the world's leading scholars, Jeff Engel, who I'll say a word about first. Jeff is presenting his manuscript, very much in progress, and the title is When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the Cold War's Peaceful End. Jeff is an associate professor of history and the director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. He's the author of numerous books. 2 of the most recent include Into the Desert, Reflections on the Gulf War, and The Fall of the Berlin Wall, the revolutionary legacy of 1989. And we're really fortunate to have Jeff with us. He's going to say a few words about his manuscript, and he's put a few chapters of it up online. I know that some of you have had a chance to look at it. Iris said, you know, you really should get a practitioner in there, somebody who knows a thing or two about how government actually works. We're very fortunate to have just the right person in this case. That's Andrew H. Card. Mr. Card was the chief of staff to President George W. Bush from January 2001 to April 2006, an extraordinary long tenure for a chief of staff, if I'm not mistaken about my history. He also has experience with Bush 1. He was his deputy chief of staff and secretary of transportation for President George H.W. Bush. Mr. Card is currently the executive director in the office of the provost at Texas A&M University, and thank goodness that Johnny Manziel was finally picked in the draft, because I was worried that we were going to lose a commentator, to be honest. Iris said you should get really a leading scholar from history and a leading scholar from another discipline, and we have those scholars with us today as well. David Farber is a professor of modern American history at Temple University. He is author of a raft of books and even more very influential articles. 2 of his recent books are Everybody Ought to Be Rich, great title. The Life and Times of John J. Raskob, capitalist, and the author of Rise and Fall of Modern American Conservatism. So thank you for joining us today, David. And commenting last, but certainly not least, is Melanie Mcallister, who's an associate professor of American Studies, International Affairs, and Media and Public Affairs. And she's also chair of her department, American Studies, at George Washington University. Melanie is the author of Epic Encounters, Culture, Media, and the U.S. Interests in the Middle East since 1945. And she's also the co-editor with Marie Griffith of Religion and Politics in the Contemporary United States. So, Ira, I know you're watching like a hawk this webcast, along with at least 7 other people. We, I think, are fulfilling not only our obligation to dream mentors, but to a dream panel for your idea of a manuscript review. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Jeff, and we'll take it away.
Thank you, Brian. It's traditional at this particular moment to say how pleased the speaker is to be here, but I have to admit that last night was the NFL draft, and I was fully expecting to be winging my way to a new city at this point. But there is also round 2 and round 3 coming up, so I have hope still. So let me begin by thanking Brian and Evan McCormick and everyone here at the Miller Center for this tremendous opportunity. It really is a wonderful opportunity for me to get important feedback at the precise moment that it's most useful, I think, from such esteemed commentators. But also I want to say that it's just wonderful to be here at the Miller Center yet again, because this really is one of the institutions that is a model for how the academy and policymaking can come together and work together and move forward together. Having just founded a new center for presidential history at SMU, I can tell you the number of times where an issue came up, an idea came up, a program came up, and we said, how does the Miller Center do it? Because they do it well. So
we asked the same question.
So we should coordinate on that. Let me also take a moment to thank, obviously, the panel, Andy Card, Melanie, and David, and for taking time out of their extraordinary busy schedules to read probably more pages than was necessary at this point for them. I'm going to do 2 things in my brief commentary. I'm not told to speak for about 10 minutes or so. I have to say my wife will often say I can't clear my throat in 10 minutes, so we'll see how far we get on this. But I'm going to do 2 things, and that first is to give you a little bit of discussion of what the book is about, how the book is set up, the methodologies involved, and the areas I'm trying to cover, and then tell you a little bit about George H.W. Bush and what the book ultimately argues, and the story which it tries to tell. The book actually tries to do several things at once. It is simultaneously a study of U.S. foreign policy during the tumultuous end of the Cold War. It's also simultaneously a group biography looking primarily at George H.W. Bush. And I should mention for the rest of this talk, whenever I mention President Bush, I of course refer to our guy, 41. And it's also a study of him and those around him, the collective biography, if you will, of American national security decision-making during this period. But then it tries to do something else. It also tries to situate American policymaking within a broader international milieu. It tries very hard to be both simultaneously an American study and international history, because time and again we discover that events that occurred during 1989, during 1990-91, were in many ways not generated by the United States. In fact, the United States was reactive, oftentimes more than prescriptive during these times. And in fact, one of the arguments which I make, which I will get to in a few moments, is that this is really the essence of President Bush's policymaking and of his foreign policy in a whole, was to be cautiously reactive, realistically reactive, without being too overly exuberant, reacting to foreign events. Because there were, of course, dramatic foreign events going on during this period. It's important to recall all that occurred during the 4 years of the Bush presidency. That list would have to include, of course, the end of the Cold War, with ensuing events such as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the breakup of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe, the breakup of the Soviet Union itself, something that few commentators, if any, anticipated even months or years before. We also have events on the other side of the globe. We have things like Tiananmen Square, democratic protests in China, which are ultimately met with repression and violence and force. Simultaneously, or almost simultaneously, we have a democratic invasion of Panama. We also have the Gulf War. We also have events going on in South Africa. We have not only the Gulf War, but further difficulties in the Middle East vis-a-vis ethnic cleansing and vis-a-vis the Kurds. And speaking of ethnic cleansing, of course, we have the beginning of the tragedy that was post-Cold War Yugoslavia. Looking at all these events, it's actually quite astounding to think that all of them occurred within the same 4-year period. In fact, I would make the argument that more occurred during President Bush's single term in office on the international scene than faced any other US president in history, with the possible exception, I think, of FDR during the height of World War II. And to each of these events, I argue, President Bush and his staff essentially adopted what I like to call Hippocratic diplomacy. That is, first do no harm. The world was, to their minds, going in the proper direction. Democracy was on the rise. Markets were on the rise. The Soviet Union and communism, the great antagonist of the democratic free world, was clearly on the decline. What would happen when the decline actually occurred, however, was something that no one could quite put their finger on. In fact, Bob Gates, who of course went on to become Secretary of Defense in later administrations, was at this point in time Deputy National Security Advisor. And Gates, who had trained as a historian, was fond of going around the White House and the NSC and telling everybody who he could, repeatedly, that never in human history had a massive empire collapsed without a major war ensuing. Consequently, when people in the White House saw the Soviet Union begin to collapse, they feared the next step in that logical chain. And at every step, the administration approached their difficulties, approached unexpected events by thinking to themselves, not what can we do, but how can we promote stability? How can we keep things which we believe are already going in the right direction, continuing to go in the right direction, without either speeding them up to the point where they might go off the rails, or without perhaps doing something which would stop the process of change, which they thought was going in the right direction. And in fact, time and again during this book, I come back to a quote uttered with no reference whatsoever to the Cold War, a quote uttered by Otto von Bismarck decades before, who said, and here I'll quote directly, "The stream of time flows inexorably along. By plunging my hand into it, I am merely doing my duty. I do not expect thereby to change its course," end quote. Now, what Bismarck is telling us here is that the world is moving in a direction. Policymakers might attempt to change things at the margins, but they're never going to change the current, never going to change the flow. And I think to myself that this is something which President Bush, though I'd never heard him once quote Bismarck on this topic, something that President Bush believed innately, that the world was going in the right direction, and that the only thing that he could do as President of the United States was to make sure it continued on that proper path without hitting the rocks along the way. And in fact, to give you a singular example of this, President Bush was pilloried, absolutely pilloried in the press during the initial aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall. An aftermath which, of course, was covered on international television to great acclaim, which people around the world saw celebrations occurring in Germany that no one had particularly ever imagined, even weeks before, could have occurred, and occurred peacefully at that. And President Bush, at one point, invited reporters into the Oval Office to witness him watching these events on TV, because he was watching them in real time like everyone else. And he's leaning back in his desk, and CBS's Leslie Stahl says to him about halfway through the press conference, "You know, Mr. President, you just don't seem excited." I mean, this is the culmination of the entire half-century Cold War effort. We won, and you don't seem excited. And he responded, I think, in a very important way. He said, "Well, I guess I'm just not an excitable guy." But that wasn't actually the truth of why he was trying to lay down his excitement. Later on in that news conference, he did point out that one of the great things about dynamic change is that it's all moving in our direction. That's a direct quote. And he did not want to, as I mentioned, change the direction. And in fact, he knew something, of course, which Leslie Stahl and the other reporters in the room did not, which was that he had spent most of the previous night and hours on the telephone with Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and especially Mikhail Gorbachev, who verily pleaded with him not to do anything. Because the great concern for all these leaders at this time was that this excitement in the crowd would get out of hand, that violence would ensue, that no one could control this incredible change that no one had foreseen. Each of them had in the back of their minds a singular example of violence of celebration going too far and being turned into violence by those who thought it had gone too far, which of course was Tiananmen Square, which had only happened several months before. And time and again, President Bush and his staff said to themselves and approached the problems of changes in Eastern Europe by suggesting, let us not go too far in celebrating those who are democratizing from the streets up. Let us not go too far in celebrating reformers, because those reformers have enemies. And those enemies, i.e. those who are in control of the communist state, have tanks and have guns. And we've seen what can happen when they get pushed too far. And ultimately, the great fear of the administration was that those conservatives, if you will, within the communist world would react to remove those like Gorbachev, who tried to push the world forward through reform. And of course, we ultimately see this fear coming true in August of 1991, when of course there was a conservative coup. At that point, without very likelihood of success, but nonetheless, the great fear that could degenerate into civil war, ethnic violence, and the like. So I argue that there are really only two moments, therefore, when President Bush essentially took off the Hippocratic gloves, if you will, and decided to push forward with initiative. The first was with reunification of Germany, because he believed that reunification of Germany in a NATO context was necessary in order to keep future stability in Europe, because having NATO in Europe allowed the Americans to also stay in Europe. And he believed very firmly that the only thing that had truly kept the peace since 1945 in Europe was the American presence. And so therefore he pushed hard for reunification on the terms that he needed, which was, again, keeping Germany in NATO. And the second moment was, of course, the Gulf War, when this strikes me as really the moment where we see the end of the Cold War. Why? Because we see two things. First, we see the Soviets coming along with the international community in a way they had never done before. The Soviets working with Britain and France and the United States in particular on a central issue of importance to all of them, the security of the Middle East. But secondly, it's the end of the Cold War, because this is a moment, I think, where President Bush begins to lay out what, of course, becomes known as his New World Order, what the world would look like after the Cold War. It's really the first time that he's willing to admit the Cold War is actually over. And then we've come to the final point which I'll make today, which is what the New World Order came to mean. In many ways, this is a phrase that has been deemed by historians and pundits at the time as being somewhat hollow, that there was nothing new within Bush's New World Order. And I think that really misses the central idea that drove the administration, this idea, again, that change was moving in America's direction. Because if we look at the tenets of the New World Order, it was not to suggest that the world was going to be perfect, but rather better. The words President Bush used, the words would be more just, more free, more secure. Not just free and secure, but more so. And ultimately, that the world would be able to take up the opportunity which had been afforded it before the Cold War even occurred, back in 1945. I argue that President Bush's vision for the post-Cold War world was the world that Franklin Roosevelt had created, but had never come to fruition because of the Cold War. Now with that, I want to thank my commentators once more and let them begin to pillory me. So, thank you.
My name is Andy Card, and I am an engineer by training, a politician by disease, and not an academic. So, and I'm barely called a practitioner, but I have been blessed to be able to be invited to read Jeff's manuscript, and I found it very, very good. So I'll start off by saying I think it was a bit mistitled because I think it's more of a biography than it is just a description of the end of the Cold War and the challenges they face. But I loved the biographical information, and I do think it's instructive to understanding kind of what made George H.W. Bush the man that he is. And so I loved the trip down memory lane, and I loved reading about one of the most respected individuals I've met in my experience in government and politics, and that's George H.W. Bush. I will also say that the instructive part of the book is the relationships that Jeff has shown that the president developed over a long period of time, especially the relationships with people who ended up being in a position to help counsel him as he had to deal with phenomenally challenging experiences. He discovered the value of wisdom, and it was not wisdom that came from him. It was wisdom that he invited from other people. And so I think that that is illustrative in what Jeff has put together. He's shown that the collection of advisors that were helping President Bush manage a process that really was not part of the political calculus. When most of these people entered into government, and many of them entered into government long before President Bush became president. I don't think that they anticipated that the day would come that the Soviet Union would implode and change, but the wisdom that they had in understanding it and dealing with it was invaluable. So I think that that was illustrative in how you develop the relationships that ended up being very important. I did find that there was some tendency to forget that the rest of the world was functioning or not functioning, and America was functioning or not functioning at the same time, as the president had to wrestle with an unbelievably fabulous opportunity. And I do agree that he came at that opportunity with a design not to manage it, but to invite its continuance. And so it was phenomenally restraining for any leader to say, this is going in the right direction. I don't need to put my hand on the tiller every moment. That ship is headed in the right direction. I could have an emotional response that might cause the tiller to turn the wrong way, and I don't want that to happen. Having said that, I want to know where the shoals are. And if the ship is heading into the shoals, I'd like somebody to blow a whistle and tell me so I can pull the tiller a little bit right or left and see if we can avoid the shoals. And I think that description really is personified with the James A. Baker III, with the Brent Scowcroft, for example, and Colin Powell, who helped to bring a breadth of experience and observations that helped to make a difference. And there were others as well. Some the president didn't really want to invite to be around him at first. I like how Jeff describes the strained relationship with another former Secretary of State who is quite prominent and is still quite prominent in the dialogue of dynamic change in the world. And yet that wisdom, I think, was facilitated by dealing with people who shared that particular Secretaries of State view on a matter of things. President Bush, I do believe, was at the cusp of change of philosophy in the White House at the same time that he was at the cusp of change of the world's powers, if you will. And the cusp of change going from a Reagan to a Bush doesn't look very dramatic. And I'm not sure that it was really dramatic, but it was a change. And Brent Scowcroft's views were very different than his predecessor's views, George Shultz. And not directly as National Security Advisor, but the views of the foreign policy community when President Reagan was dealing with the opportunity for change that had already started to emerge through Gorbachev. And that comes through in Jeff's books, too. This was not something that happened only under President Bush's tenure. The seeds of change actually were planted overseas by others, and you wondered how well fertilized they would be, or when they would be watered, and whether it would produce beautiful flowers, or whether it would produce weeds. And I think that the seeds themselves were not our seeds. I think they were invited by our government and how our government functions of, by, and for the people, and how our economy thrives through entrepreneurship and creativity and the courage to take risks and fail and find success. And those were things that were lacking in the Soviet Union. And I think Gorbachev recognized they were lacking and that he needed to make changes, so he helped to identify the seeds that should be planted and where they should be planted. We had to make sure that somebody didn't put Roundup on the seeds. And I think that's probably what President Bush did very, very well, but he did it by having the benefit of counsel from lots of different people who didn't all share the same view, except they shared the same commitment. And I think that was of great benefit to the president, and I do think that's reflected in the early stages of the book. The challenge that I have reading this book as it is maturing, I do feel as if I'm anxious to turn on the radio, and this dates me, but I used to love to listen to Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. I want to know what the rest of the story is, and I want to make sure that you set the stage for the rest of the story, and I think there are some things still missing in the book. I would suggest the relationship that Margaret Thatcher was going through in her own caucus, in her own country, also had an impact on the debate that took place in Washington, D.C. and at other capitals, especially in Europe, especially when you consider that Europe was trying to give itself definition as an entity rather than just have the sovereign definition of its members. And that was a strained period of time in the relationship between the British and the French. Wait a minute, it's always a strained relationship in time between, but it was particularly strained at this period of time as Europe was trying to give definition to itself, and the British were reluctant to be part of the full definition, and the French were demanding that their definition be the definition. So I think that was a dynamic that also impacted some of the discussions about the changes that were taking place in the Soviet Union and how we should respond to those changes. There was also the economic opportunity that was perceived by Europe, actually before it was perceived by the United States, for some of the opportunities through change in the Soviet Union. And so I think there were other interests at play as the Soviet Union was struggling to deal with a reform that really wasn't invited, it was imposed. But it was invited, I think, for a noble reason and a noble expectation. However, at the time, most of us in the United States were cynical of the person that presented the reform. And is there a more Machiavellian reason for Gorbachev to do what he is doing, or was it in fact a noble call? I think history has shown that it was more noble than Machiavellian, but he came from a Machiavellian society, so I'm sure Machiavelli guided a lot of the people around him, and some of those players are still on the stage. And they are looking for Machiavelli to give them another opportunity, and we're witnessing that now. So I think that would be an interesting thing to put in the mix of not just what was happening here. You touched a little bit on what was happening in Soviet Union or in Russia, and they seldom called it Russia at the time, but there was still a Russian influence within the Soviet Union, and some of the leaders. Well, I'm going to reflect on our own revolution. I'm on the board of the Museum of the American Revolution, which is a brand new museum being constructed in Philadelphia. So I love going to the board meetings because great historians come and tell us about our own revolution, and I learn something every time. But George Washington wasn't winning every battle. In fact, he lost most battles as they were building up to the opportunity at Yorktown. Now, my friends in Massachusetts, they were hanging tough. They were going to be in it to the bitter end no matter what. Quite a few people in Pennsylvania were saying, wait a minute, we want to be with the winner. And some people in Virginia started to think, hey, maybe we want to be with the winner too. Who's the winner going to be? So there were, in South Carolina, they figured we weren't going to be the winner, so they were looking to get on the side of the perceived winner. I suspect a lot like that was happening in the Soviet Union. as Gorbachev is wrestling with the reforms that he wants to put in place. And obviously we know that the coup attempt had an impact on the relationship that Gorbachev had with not only the Soviet Union, but with Russia. And that was, I think, an undercurrent all of the time that Gorbachev was bringing his view of reform to the people of the Soviet Union and to the countries. And satellite countries were definitely, in my opinion, trying to decide who's the winner, what side is going to be on. So there was a dynamic there that I think President Bush managed better than historians acknowledge. So he was cognizant of the East Germans, the Czechoslovakians, and the Baltic states. He was cognizant of what their challenges were as they were trying to deal with an unsettled relationship that they had either liked or not liked. But it was still, who's the winner going to be? And do they have the courage to make sure there is a winner, or do they want to wait to see which one emerges? So I think that was a tricky period of time in the diplomatic front that President Bush and his team, and particularly Brent Scowcroft and Jim Baker, I think, were increasingly sensitive to it. And their Brent Scowcroft's experience and Larry Eagleburg's experience, for example, in Yugoslavia, I think was very helpful as you had to deal with some of these dynamics within the Soviet extended family. So I would say that you've got a great start. You've told the story of how President Bush became so grounded in his responsibilities and expectations and the noble call of public service. I think you've developed a great understanding for us to know why the players that President Bush brought him around him were gathered to be around him and what their relevance was. I think you've given a pretty good description of how Europe was starting to observe what was happening. I don't think you've gone enough into the relationship between some of the French and British leaders that actually did impact the dialogue that took place in diplomatic circles and at NATO, and how NATO was responding at the same time, because there were real skeptics within NATO, and the Schultz-Reagan expectation was more optimistic, and the Bush team coming in was a little more pessimistic as they made the change from a Reagan philosophy to a Bush philosophy, which was not supposed to be a dramatic change, and it was not, but it was definitely a change. And President Bush, I think, benefited by having been in the Reagan administration and very much understanding of what their observations and expectations were, but he also had the benefit of people who were out, who had been observing and had very different expectations in how to deal with them. And I think that dynamic is pretty interesting. But I am ready for Paul Harvey's rest of the story. And so I want this to be a productive effort rather than destructive. And I would like to see the book published. And I think that it will have appeal far beyond the academic community. And I also would remind you that President Bush, number 41, was truly remarkable in that he not only did he have to deal with the things that Jeff talked about that we all can remember from the foreign policy front, but he also got the Americans with Disability Act passed. He got the Clean Air Amendment passed. He negotiated the first agreement to reduce ozone depleting gases. He took tremendous effort to make changes in how Congress worked to get a budget deal done, and he did that all with one four-year term. I think he was the most productive one-term president in the history of our country.
Are you launching his re-election campaign?
It may take the form of somebody with other initials. Thank you.
That's the proverbial tough act to follow. Thanks so much, Brian. Thanks, Will Hitchcock and other people at the Miller Center for inviting me here, and to Jeff for giving me this opportunity to, well, talk about his manuscript. So Jeff brings to this project a tremendous breadth of understanding regarding American international relations at the cusp of the 1980s and 1990s, and a deep, nuanced understanding of President Bush's personality, character, and style of leadership. Reading through this portion of the manuscript, I felt quite confident that Jeff knows in depth the key individuals and events that compromise the history he wants to explore and explain. I learned a great deal from this manuscript about President Bush and felt like I understand how an extraordinary man faced a momentous challenge in service to his nation and the values he cherished, values he rarely articulated and perhaps felt no need to define. In the pages of this manuscript, President Bush is warmly portrayed, but the broad history reads too as a critical recounting of Bush's decision-making and hints as well at the limits of President Bush's worldview as he cautiously and prudently oversaw the American government's response to the end of the Soviet Union, the restructuring of Eastern Europe, and the energetic leap of China into world political and economic affairs. Up front, Jeff explains, as he told us before, that his project attempts to bring together three key narratives. One, the arc of President Bush's leadership in ending the Cold War. A second is the partnership between Bush and Gorbachev, a part we haven't quite gotten to yet in this hunk of the manuscript. And the third is a tale of the group of world leaders that played key roles in the unfolding of the last years of the Cold War, what Jeff calls an international history. Overall, Jeff writes, this is not the story of crowds, which is how the story of the end of the Cold War is often told, he writes, but is emphatically a history from above, a history in which leadership matters. Because this is a story of leadership, much of what Jeff explores in detail, and here I'm sort of following up on Andy's comments, regard his main protagonist, President Bush, and they're questions primarily of Bush's personality and character. Though not only, mainly this is presidential history, in which policy, government procedure, political culture, and even politics figure far less than presidential personality in service to presidential decision-making. Through interviews with President Bush and several other key figures, as well as an extraordinary scouring of White House and other relevant archival materials, Jeff does deliver a resounding inside-out portrait of a famously non-introspective man. President Bush's decency shines through in this history. So does Bush's caution, his willingness, as Jeff writes, to play the tortoise to Gorbachev's hair, to practice what, as Jeff just said, he calls cleverly Hippocratic diplomacy. Those are core aspects of President Bush's character, Jeff argues, and that they were well suited to the complex unfolding of events that comprise the end of the Cold War. What does not much appear in these pages, is the Bush that his critics saw. There's a bit of this criticism and of Jeff's sense for Bush's ideological limits in Chapter 7. I don't know if many of you saw that yet. But one does not see here the kind of distanced understanding of Bush that one might expect from a historian so well-versed in the historical context of the later decades of the 20th century. For example, President Bush obviously was an ardent advocate and practitioner of free market economics. He lived and socialized in a world in which economic success, often based on entrepreneurial risk-taking, was normative and expected, though by no means a be-all and end-all. Bush, I would think, trusted certain kinds of men and certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of wisdom, and had little or no interest in perspectives that did not fit the social, political, and economic conventions he had inherited. He counted on a world in which profitable international trade, arranged by elites, figured world progress. He accepted social hierarchies of all kinds, even as his core decency and civility buffered him from the sense that the world he inhabited and treated as natural was created to benefit some and limit the life courses of others. Angle in the relatively few pages, see I switched from Jeff to Angle now. Angle in the relatively few pages he devotes to explaining Bush's political position calls Bush's point of view moderate progressivism that privileged the merits of cooperation. That's a quote. But what does that mean in a broad historical context? Did Bush believe in cooperation between organized international labor and business? Did he believe or advocate for progress in women's roles in society? Did he believe in the merits of cooperation when it came to the likes of Saddam Hussein? The Bush and Engels work is, to some extent, from a broader historical context, unproblematized and unabstracted. His character is revealed even as the well-armored and rarely interrogated truths of his social and economic position, some of them, I would think, quite hard-nosed and aggressive, are unquestioned. Bush is, of course, an individual, and the biographical detail revealed in Jeff's work is marvelously recounted. But Bush is also a representative of a particular milieu and historical moment, whose leadership is demonstrative of a worldview and social position, and those historical rather than biographical markers are largely left unexplored here. Jeff calls Bush a company man. It's a telling phrase, but a largely left unexplained term, and it strikes me as perhaps misleading. Bush is a leader. He's not a middle manager. He works extraordinarily well in certain kinds of organizations, but is profoundly uninterested in applying himself to solving a great many other sorts of problems. He's a great patriot, but his interest in using American power abroad is reflective not of a generalized faith in American values, but of a particularized vision of American principles and interests, and those are largely left undefined here, in part because President Bush himself rarely articulated them. But even though President Bush did not articulate these values, I think Jeff has to do more inductive reasoning to explain those views to get at those issues. How such a blinkered and robust, energetic will to power and leadership translates into a policy-driven understanding of strategy in a fast-changing international arena in the late 80s and early 90s is largely left unsaid. At least sometimes I think Jeff needs not take President Bush at his word, but instead to think about how his actions and policies demonstrate what Bush really meant when he used words like freedom, and how he saw the role of individuals and corporations and governments in achieving a society which allowed, as Bush orated, the exercise of free will, unhampered by the state. In more concrete terms, I think that Jeff might make Bush's exercise of character more vivid by giving us a better sense of how he made decisions and how he processed the massive flow of information that came at him in the midst of so many momentous events. The pocket portraits of James Baker, Brent Scowcroft, and a few other of Bush's key advisors are well told here, and their utility in advising President Bush is well articulated. But as far as I can tell, at least in the section we have, the CIA, the NSA, the NSC, and even the State Department rarely, if ever, appear in these pages. My understanding is that President Bush was a firm believer in the products produced by the intelligence community and was a regular consumer of such briefings. But we don't see that material here. Maybe it will come later in the manuscript. In the pages I read, Bush relies overwhelmingly on his own feelings about the USSR and Gorbachev, as well as China and Deng, in pursuing his international policies. This vision of Bush might be true, I don't know, but I would think that other critical agencies and executive branches would be channeling information to the White House, and I wonder why this info does not reach Bush, or if Bush simply dismisses it, or what. I don't really know. I would think it would figure more prominently in the White House. Overall, Jeff is dedicated to arguing that leadership matters, and that different leaders do things for their own reasons. But I have little sense in these pages I read of President Bush as the head of the executive branch of the government, who sits atop a mountain of information formulated by a broad range of experts representing different bureaucracies, administrative and political views and agendas. Presidential decision-making under Bush, in Jeff's account, seems extraordinarily tightly circumscribed and based on little empirical information. In contrast, the marvelous book of essays produced by the Miller Center on the Bush presidency that was just published by Cornell, in the particular essay by Bartholomew Sparrow, and it comes right before Jeff's essay in this book, argues that the Bush White House managed, quote, national security perhaps as well as it could have been managed in the momentous era of world history, and that their success was in large measure the product of their policy process. Now, I know Jeff's writing for a broad audience and that the conventions of presidential history demand a focus on the president and his tight circle of leaders. And after Doris Kearns Goodwin's great Lincoln biography with its genius term, a team of rivals, we're all kind of looking for that kind of clever way to encapsulate this sense of how presidential administrations actually work. Still, I think Jeff can do much more in explaining how Bush, the company man, produced and orchestrated such a superb foreign policy team, and how specifically Bush was able to train his attention on key materials and receive the kind of advice he did. While issues of administration and administrative procedure can be dull, they can also be fascinating, as many a best-selling book on business management shows, and I think demonstrative of the degree to which good administration and good management are the lifeblood of good decision-making. I have a feeling that as historians look back at the Bush White House, that administrative capacity and decision-making processes will be a key aspect of the historiography of the modern presidency. The Bush presidency, I think, will stand out for that particular set of abilities and talent. And while it seems very likely that Sparrow is right in praising the Bush White House's effort, I do think we need to know, too, where that system of White House advising failed, or at least failed to deliver key information or insight. In other words, what did the system fail to produce, and what kind of advisors were unable to make themselves heard in the White House? Leadership, as Jeff argues, is a critically important aspect of the history of the Cold War. I think greater attention to how Bush led his White House and his administration into the unavoidable fog of international security policymaking would strengthen the analytic power of this work. In a related vein, I was surprised by how little attention Jeff gives to Congress, to public opinion, or the political context in which Bush operates. More than 300 pages into the manuscript, he gives the readers about 5 pages on such matters, but the treatment's fairly cursory. Does such indifference to democratic politics and the democratic process reflect Bush's own dismissal of such matters, or is it indicative of the kind of leader Bush was, or a leader relatively indifferent or disdainful of the democratic polity, or what? Jeff says he's much interested in accounting. Jeff says he's not much interested in accounting for the behavior of crowds in ending the Cold War. But the near absence of the American people, either as actors in their own right or as subjects of President Bush's concerns, is striking. President Bush clearly was not President Clinton, who was energized by an interest in interacting with individual Americans of all kinds. But I do wonder what the patrician president made of his duties to the demos he was charged with leading throughout the turmoil of the late 80s and early 90s. Finally, I want to comment on Jeff's deep foray into the writing of what he calls international history. Jeff spends a great many pages writing not about President Bush and the Bush White House policymaking, but about the parallel histories of how other nation-states approached the ending of the Cold War. China and Chinese leaders in particular figure prominently in the manuscript sections I read. A main reason the manuscript has so many pages, and there were a lot of pages, is that Jeff, in a tour de force job of research and writing, gives his readers long narratives of how the end of the Cold War appeared to those nations and why their most prominent leaders saw the world as they did. Such pocket histories greatly expand the breadth of Jeff's story and greatly deepen his explanations of the context in which American policymakers must act and in which presidential decisions often depend. Such an international perspective in which other nations and foreign leaders are in a sense juxtaposed to the American perspective have become the fashion in the writing of diplomatic and international relations history for a very good reason. Such broad perspectival histories make clear that the United States policymakers act in a world bound by different interests and different principles, which makes the American position in the world both clear in its distinctions and its similarities to other powers, both great and small. This internationalizing project has then obvious strengths, and the pages Jeff spends on its parallel accounts are compelling. But at risk of being a contrarian, I also see a weakness in this approach. And I think I'm following a little bit of what Andy Card said. Jeff almost never relates these parallel histories or foreign leaders' perceptions and actions to U.S. policymaking or to President Bush's understanding of the changing strategic environment in which he must operate. Rather than give readers such lengthy, nearly independent accounts of different nations and different leaders' historical understandings and trajectories, my thought is that it would be more useful and perhaps central to his actual research and argument if he told us what Bush administration officials did and did not know about these foreign histories and foreign policies and foreign leaders' views. Instead, he just shows them as concurrent events or semi-parallel tracks to what's happening in the Bush administration. Perhaps what these foreign leaders understand and did not understand about the United States and the Bush White House would better explain the critical interaction between those nations and the Bush-led White House. I would think it more pertinent to the core story of President Bush's international cold leadership to analyze what the White House understands and does not understand, knows and does not know about foreign leaders' actions and the political context in which those leaders feel they must act. Here, too, the lack of historical counting by angle of internal information dissemination about international affairs within the Bush policymaking apparatus is striking. The process of policymaking and the information and cultural precepts and ideological understandings that undergird that policymaking is quite often missing from Jeff's kaleidoscopic history. Jeff's parallel stories of the last years of the Cold War are informative, but given that the core story here is how the Bush White House managed the end of the Cold War, I think an opportunity is missed. I wonder if fewer pages on the historical trajectory of other nation states and more pages on how the White House under Bush perceived these key nations and how they perceived the United States might make for a sharper analytic approach to the role of international leadership and to the American role in the leadership bringing the Cold War to an end. To some extent, I hope you see that my critical concerns here are just a way to show that I actually read the manuscript and that I've earned my invitation here. Many thanks to Jeff and to the Miller Center for giving me the chance to read this, and like Andy, I can't wait to see the rest of this manuscript. Thanks so much.
Wow, I got Friday afternoon at 1 o'clock, huh? It's great to be here. I'm really happy to be a part of this discussion, and thank you to the Miller Center also for letting me be part of it. And also, I presume Jeffrey might have had something to do with this, and I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to get to read this manuscript as it is about halfway. We read a little less than half of the final manuscript, so one of the great things about that, I guess, is that you'll get to stand up and say that all of this will be taken care of in the last half, right? I really enjoyed the book as it stands now, and one of the things I appreciated was that it did take such careful attention to the characters, the people around Bush in particular. He has a lot of sort of short biographies of important policymakers. And I've seen this in other histories too, and sometimes it can have that feel of like early vaudeville where a character comes in and speaks for a minute and then there's a crook that comes and pulls them off, you know, and then another one shows up. And that doesn't happen here. It actually really integrates, I think, in a beautiful way to helping us understand what the Bush White House looked like and what people brought into those discussions, and that I appreciated. I have one fairly large question and three more specific ones that I'd like to talk about. One is to ask Jeffrey what you thought about the more some of the recent scholarship on the Cold War that really ask us to think about the Cold War as something that happens in the Third World. So I'm thinking of Westad's book, The Global Cold War, and a lot of the scholarship that has followed from that, which argues, as you do, that the Cold War is not just an East-West Soviet Union-US conflict, but also argues that China is central, as you do, and I think crucially so. And I know the Iraq War is coming in the manuscript, and I can't wait to read that. But I wonder, several times in the manuscript, you talk about, in the Cold War period, talk about the proxy wars that are happening elsewhere. And I think some scholarship more recently, and to my mind, helpfully, has argued that when we think about the wars that are happening elsewhere, we need to think of the Cold War as a factor, but not as a puppet master for what else is going on in the world. So bringing the Cold War in, or bringing other places into our thinking about the Cold War, seems to me to allow us to complicate the narrative of what else is going on in the world as a set of proxy wars, but also to complicate how we think about the Cold War itself. And I'll just mention, lately I've been doing some research on South Africa, and as we think about what's going on in the 1980s, we can think about South Africa as something that was understood. The events in South Africa and the slow end of apartheid over the course of the 1980s is something that was understood, certainly by Reagan, very much in a Cold War context, but which was also something else altogether. So when you talk about the Cold War and Reagan's relationship to it, South Africa is barely mentioned, and of course you can't do everything, I know that. But the period from 1984 to 1989, as soon-to-be President Bush is developing his thinking about foreign policy, includes the township revolts in South Africa, the state of emergency for 5 years. Then in 1989, the desegregation of public facilities in South Africa. De Klerk meets Mandela in that year. Mandela is released in 1990. The ANC is unbanned. And the repeal of apartheid laws in 1991. And of course, we know the elections a couple of years later. So the end of the Cold War does involve the slowing down and ultimately the end of U.S. support for apartheid, but it also involves, the end of apartheid involves a great many other things. The U.S. is nonetheless central to that whole conversation. I think that events in South Africa are also central to how people are thinking about the Cold War, at least a certain subset of people. So I'd like to hear from you whether you agree with Westad and others' take on the importance of the Cold War as a story of the Global South. In other words, what other parts of the story might you have told if there were worlds enough in time, and how does the Global South figure in before Iraq or simultaneously to it? So I have three more specific questions. I think David quoted the line in the introduction where you say the story you're telling is not a story of crowds. And yet, I really want to ask, where are the social movements in this story? Now, there's a great moment, if brief, in one part of the manuscript talking about the movement against medium-range missiles in Europe and the West German anti-nuclear movement. But there's very little talking about social movements in the United States, those which may have at least shaped the world in which President Bush had to make decisions. I think sometimes, and I suspect a little of this, that U.S. historians, especially diplomatic historians, might allow that other countries have social movements, but mostly the U.S. has TV. You know, so there's going to be a lot about social movements in China. There is, of course, in Eastern Europe. But in the United States, liberals liberals in particular are involved in anti-apartheid activism and activism against the Contras in the 1980s. Of course, anti-nuclear activism, which I'll come back to in a minute. Liberals and conservatives involved deeply in human rights activism vis-a-vis the Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And that activism really does, I think, as I'll come to in a minute, shape the response to Gorbachev in public and the ways in which his popularity becomes such an issue for the Bush White House. So there's a great moment when Jeffrey talks about his reaction to the day after the 1983 movie, which I also remember very well too, that scared everybody to death about nuclear war, but there's no mention of 1 million people showing up in Central Park the year before to protest nuclear war and potential of, and as well as nuclear weapons, the potential of nuclear war and also nuclear power. So I think that some of the embrace of Gorbachev, both in the US and in Europe, has to do with an activist and activated social movement, one that linked human rights issues going on in Eastern Europe in particular with anti-nuclear activism. And that in part, these folks are coming together. They're so excited about Gorbachev. They're so excited about the possibility of the end of the Cold War and maybe the disappointment with the pause. And here I will come back to David's point about Congress or other political actors. Maybe this disappointment, this deep disappointment with the pause where the Bush administration comes in and basically says, we're going to think a lot now for the first 5 months. And this is beautifully described, but the disappointment that the public felt maybe is not just a disappointment about sort of presidential leadership in general or how people are supposed to take advantage of the 100 days, but about a whole realm of people who are really hoping for change and who have been out there protesting, worrying, watching television for sure, but making a social movement, a set of social movements, very different ones. So the anti-nuclear movement and the human rights movement sometimes overlapped and sometimes were very different people. But they were all paying great attention to what was happening, and I would like to hear a little bit more about those crowds. My second point is that, very related to this one, is that I think that Americans' feelings about the Cold War, and you know, what we have kind of goes through the beginning of 1989, so it's not just that I'm obsessed with the Cold War itself and not its end, but that's what we're talking about mostly in the manuscript we have, that Americans' feelings about the Cold War were a little bit more nuanced, and I mean here popular opinion, than the story that Jeffrey tells. So he is great on the Reagan versus the Bush White House opinions about Gorbachev and about the Soviet Union, and Reagan being so, you can just see Reagan so optimistic and hopeful, and Bush coming in more careful and wary, and the advisors around him very similarly. But when we think about how Americans were thinking about the end of the Cold War, the potential end of the Cold War, the late Cold War, Jeffrey mentions that there is a popular wariness about the Soviet Union. Polls show that people might like Gorbachev, but they're still wary about the Soviet Union, and so they have some real doubts about what the U.S. should do in terms of disarmament. But I think that people's fear in the Cold War, although it is often phrased as being wary about the Soviet Union, in practice is also deep wariness and anger and fear about the events, about the threats that the Cold War raised. So nuclear war is a real fear. People are really worried about it in the 1980s. The money that's being spent on weapons in times of already some serious economic crisis, people are worried, and that there's a kind of tension in public opinion that I'd like to see unpacked a little bit more. That the Reagan and Bush White Houses might have been neatly divided, but I think many people in the American public were divided against themselves. The complexity of what people felt about the dangers of the Soviet Union, but also the dangers of the nuclear buildup, seemed to me to involve a sort of more level, need a greater level of nuance in unpacking that. And I think there's, as it stands, too much of a sense of the Cold War sort of going from duck and cover to 1989 with not too much change in how the American public thought about it. And in fact, I think we see enormous change and complexity that I'd like to hear a little bit more about. And finally, briefly, so the Middle East. I am really interested in how you're going to talk about the Iraq War, perhaps not surprisingly. But I'm interested in thinking, too, about what the Bush White House comes in with and how prepared they are or are not for dealing with what happens in Kuwait and ultimately the onset and pursuit of the first Iraq War, what was then called the Second Persian Gulf War, but now we call it the First Iraq War. Reagan had paid a lot of attention to the Middle East for very good reasons, and I'll just mention two. Of course, the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, well, I'll mention three, and the ensuing bombing of the Marine barracks in 1983, which was in many ways an extraordinary disaster for U.S. foreign policy. And of course, ongoing attention to the Iran-Iraq war, in which the policy of dual containment of supporting first Iran and then Iraq and then Iran and then Iraq played ultimately a real role in how I believe, would play a real role in how a number of policymakers are thinking about the region and the necessity of, quote, containing Iraq as a regional power when the U.S. goes into the war in Iraq in 1990-91. So I'd like to know whether the Bush administration policymakers come in with the Middle East on their agenda in some way, and to what degree, and how prepared are they for what is going to happen in Iraq just a year after right during the middle of the end of the Cold War vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. So these are some questions that I bring to the overall manuscript and to what is going to come in the next half. That said, and I will agree again that this is an extraordinary manuscript, and I have to say, I did say this to several people coming in, I am not only not a presidential biographer, I usually approach presidential biographies with a certain amount of dread. And I did approach this one with some question about how fascinating it would be to read, knowing it would be important. And it was fascinating to read. It was actually hard to put down. It's beautifully written and very exciting. And it tells the story of, and I did love the international history component and the bringing in of those long but fascinating to me chapters about what else is going on in the world, sort of separate from how the U.S. saw it. And the combination of paying close attention to the policy-making leaders in the United States and the context in the rest of the world has led to what I think is one of the most promising manuscripts for thinking about this period I could imagine, and I'm really looking forward to the book.
Okay, we're going to give Jeff a chance to respond, and then we're going to take, we have at least 45 minutes to take questions from our distinguished audience. We're going to open it up, and to give Jeff a little more time to think about his 6 pages of notes. Is that what I see here? I'm going to take this moment to thank a couple of people as we wrap up this conference. First and foremost, Evan D. McCormick, stand up. Evan. I can assure you none of us would be here without Evan. And I also want to thank Reed Forbes, who coordinated all of the food and drink and logistics of the conference. And I want to thank Rob Canaveri and the AV staff, the web staff, and the ultimate compliment to Rob is you haven't even seen him yet. Everything has worked very smoothly. So thanks very much. And now back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Thank you. Although you should offer your comments too, because I know you read it as well.
Well,
dying to hear that, so.
I will give you. I'll give you 15 more seconds, and I feel the way Melanie does about most presidential biographies. And 3 things happened for me in the pages that I was able to read that have never happened before with a presidential biography. I laughed, I cried, and I wanted to know more. So that's my basic take on what I've read so far. I think it's beautifully written, and I can't wait to see the final version.
Thank you. I should mention that he told me earlier that he cried when he had to pick it up. So, obviously I'm in an awkward position now because these are such wonderful and synthetic and thoughtful comments, and it would be very easy, as was already alluded to simply say, oh yeah, that's all going to be explained in pages to come. So let me just cut to the chase and say, that's all going to be explained in pages to come. And in particular, I want to explain to everyone here that what people here were offered was about 40% of the manuscript. And there's about another 10% that's been written, but the place where we are, these kind folks had to read, is essentially the early spring of 1989. So a lot's about to happen. And I'm really grateful in particular for David's point that I need to ensure that there is a thoughtful analysis of how decision-making and intelligence in particular is used by the White House. And especially that's useful as I'm going forward, because I believe that there are crises that are about to explode, which will give opportunity to see how the White House uses information. And it's helpful to go back now with your comments and think about not only the previous discussions to show how Bush is integrating information up through the spring of 1989, but also to really keep a keen eye on that as I go forward. And in fact, I'll make just preview something that I've written but you have not seen, which is the discussion of Tiananmen Square. And here I think I can say that this is an area where I have a real criticism of the president's handling of events for informational reasons that is different from the way that he handled Soviet affairs. For Soviet affairs, I think Bush was very, very good about integrating intelligence information, and as you point out, I need to do a better job of showing that going forward. For China, the president really considered himself to be his own China expert and understood China, he thought, as well as anybody, better than anybody in many cases. Of course, he had served as de facto ambassador to China. He had had a deep relationship with Chinese leaders for many years up to this point. And it's very interesting to me that policymakers, Bush, Baker in particular, in fact, this is an area where the only area really where James Baker inserts himself into Tiananmen Square. For the most part, things blow up in Tiananmen Square, and this is a little bit hyperbolic in description, but things blow up in Tiananmen Square, and James Baker essentially says, I'm focused on the Soviet Union, and leaves it to Scowcroft and leaves it to others to do, and the president to deal with it. And he actually admits this in his memoirs, Baker does, because he says the president was the expert on China, and I was trying to deal with complex issues on the other side of the world. But interestingly enough, for all these people dealing with China, things go south in China. There are protests that seem optimistic and then, of course, get repressed. But for the most part, the administration views them in terms of what's going on throughout the rest of the world. Baker, in particular, says, look, these people are marching just like they are in Eastern Europe. And I go into a great detail to show that, no, they actually were not. That they were, yes, they were marching. Yes, they were carrying banners saying freedom and democracy. And both Eastern Europeans and Chinese protesters were smart enough to put those signs in English so they could be read by an international audience. But I argue that the Chinese actually Chinese students had a very different conception of what freedom meant and what reforms they were looking for and what they wanted what change they wanted to bring about. And that nuance, I think, was not seen by the administration, which is significant, I think, in sense of unpacking their worldview, though I would argue that no matter what the perception of what Chinese protesters were doing vis-a-vis European protesters, I think the Bush administration would have adopted the same policy approach to China, which was simply to say, yes, Tiananmen was horrible and horrific in ways that defy description, but the stream of history is still moving forward. So let's make sure that we don't cut China off as opposed to bringing it in. And so again, this is something which I want to explore, and I'm really glad you brought my attention to that. One other, and so I think the crises are a great way to see that. One other point which I'll make and then leave it open to discussion is really this question of that Melanie raises of what is the domestic scene and how is that affecting U.S. policy? Because I think you actually make an extraordinarily brilliant insight, which is that U.S. foreign policy people are really good at and have thought a lot about domestic affairs in other countries, but not in their own. I mean, that's really, really smart, and I have to really pay attention to that because it's 100% true. We're really bad at unpacking our own society, and so that's something that I think really needs to be paid attention to. But it's interesting, you raise the issue of the global South and what the importance was there. And here I suspect I'm going to become remarkably unpopular in about 10 seconds to say that the argument that the global South drove the Cold War or was definitive of the Cold War at the very least does not appear within the Bush record. That here is a case in point where lots of events are going on. South Africa is a tremendous example. There's unbelievable change in South Africa, historic change, unprecedented change, and the administration largely says, see, everything's going our way throughout the world. Now let's focus on the real locus of attention, which is Gorbachev. And if we can just get the center of the world right, which is Europe, then everything else will unfold, and all will be nirvana throughout the developing world. So I think here's a case where I do not see the South, global South, playing a particular role, again, within the way the Bush administration dealt with things. And that's not to say for earlier administrations, but certainly for the Bush administration, that seems to be the way I'm reading their discussions. I think after that, I should probably just throw it open and
Great.
hear other
If
thoughts.
you put your hands up, we'll start with Jim, and I'm taking notes, and just signal to me, even while someone's talking, signal quietly, and I'll get around to you. And if everybody would simply identify themselves before they ask their question.
Sure. Jim Hirschberg from George Washington University. One quick question for Jeffrey, and two very small questions that I hope will be relevant for Jeffrey, for Andrew. One for Jeff. I know that you know that I'm a huge believer in international history and using international sources, and amazing materials are now open in Moscow as well as on Kohl, on Mitterrand, and Thatcher. I'm just curious if you could identify any one lingering mystery in your research so far that you most want to solve. What would that be? Because there may be possibilities in going for unusual sources that could lead in that direction. And my questions for Andrew Card both involve issues of H.W. Bush's personality that you would not find in documents, but I think are very relevant. Where I had a certain impression about Bush from distant observation, but you were very close, so I'm curious your opinion. One had to do with his attitude about the Cold War when he first became president. My general sense is that in terms of psychology and personality, that George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter would have been most comfortable had they switched positions as president. That George H.W. Bush was very comfortable waging the Cold War, and it took a period of psychological adjustment to really become comfortable with the idea that this is all over and this is a new world. And whereas Jimmy Carter wanted to end the Cold War and had to adjust to essentially becoming a resolute Cold Warrior. And I'm just curious if that was your sense watching him closely, that he was built to wage the Cold War, and he really had to psychologically overcome that in the period that Jeff has started writing about. The second had to do with what I see as George H.W. Bush's greatest foreign policy failure, aside from his admitted successes. And I don't know whether Jeffrey will get to this issue in his book, but I presume he will. And that was his decision not to intervene to limit the war in the former Yugoslavia at a time when the U.S. had maximum credibility after its defeat of Iraq, and essentially squandering that credibility, using as an excuse, well, let's let the Europeans handle it, even after it was clear that the Europeans were bungling and not able to handle it. And I just wondered to what extent those were legitimate policy considerations. To what extent it was essentially just psychological exhaustion and distraction after the stress of waging the Iraq war, as well as simply dealing with the process of change in Europe, as opposed to legitimate policy arguments that were being made. Thank you.
Great. Why don't you go first?
I was going to say Andy should go first because I want to hear what he has to say. In brief, interestingly enough, the biggest mystery and question I had, we just got solved. And I say we because there's a large team of people who are working very hard and have been since 2004, actually before that, but I was involved in 2004, to bring new documents out of the Bush Library. And the archivists there and the National Archives have done just heroic work, and they really need to be lauded and applauded for it, to bring out new documents. At one point, we had more documents requested for declassification review than all the other presidential libraries combined. And that made us feel good. And we just started to really get them out. So one of the mysteries, so I just got a huge tranche of documents just a few months ago. One of the things that was in there was something that had really gotten under my skin, which was the minutes of the first National Security Council meeting after Saddam Hussein invaded in August 1991, or 1990. This was troubling because all the other minutes from the war had already been released. And the first one still was not. And in fact, I thought it was particularly unfair because President Bush and Richard Haas and others quote in their memoirs from this meeting, and others, the UN ambassador, for example, has a long discussion of what the meeting was like, although it subsequently turns out he was in New York at the time, which should tell us something about memory. And it was really unfair to me, it seemed, that other people could quote this and we couldn't. If you want to say what happened in the meeting, that's one thing, but if you can't have a quote, that doesn't seem like good baseball. And so we finally got it. And all I can tell you is, boy, was that classified for a reason. I can go into great detail, which I won't now, about what, the truly horrific things that are said about American allies at this moment of great crisis. That it's probably good that the WikiLeaks folks didn't get that first. So that mystery was solved. There was another part to your question, which
for Andy.
Andy, please.
Vis-a-vis President Bush's capacity to, what war did he want to be engaged in? Maybe that's, he's really not someone who likes war. I mean, no, Cold War or hot war. He was, I really think that his makeup, and partly because I think he went to war as a teenager, that, gee, this is not good, cold or hot. So he was not a warrior president at all. And so I don't think that he was relishing Jimmy Carter's role. Oh, I wish I could have been there for that. I think he was actually going to be very careful with the role that he was assigned so that he didn't create a Cold War or a hot war. So I think so. He was a very good listener. And most presidents, I find, aren't good listeners. He was a very good listener. And he was slow to respond, and sometimes frustratingly slow, but he was very contemplative. And he was actually quiet in his response. It wasn't a bombastic response. Even in meetings where others were being very bombastic, he kind of allowed the bombast to come out. It sat there, and then he'd calmly respond to it, which was really quite effective. Now, with regard to the foreign policy failure that you cite, which was Yugoslavia, and I'm going to almost agree with you, not quite as failure, but as really tough. But I think the president was influenced by two people who I mentioned earlier who had a parochial view of Yugoslavia because they had served there, Brent Scowcroft and Larry Eagleberger. And they were very influential in the debates that took place with Larry in the Deputies Committee and with Brent, obviously, in the National Security Committee. And I don't want to say that they were invested in the geography and how that geography had been defined, but my perception was they didn't recognize just how darn tribal Yugoslavia was, and most of the challenges in Yugoslavia at the time resulted in the tribes deciding to organize rather than the nation trying to organize it. Yugoslavia was held together because of a dictator. It was a country created after the World War, and it was held together by Tito and how he did his job. And most diplomats like the world order not to change. So they like the boundaries, the national boundaries, to be as they have been. And so we can deal with whatever institutions are chosen to lead within those boundaries. When Yugoslavia started to implode, because the strong leader was no longer leading, they said, no, we have to maintain those boundaries, maintain those borders. And I think that it failed to recognize the strong tribal, and I use tribal not by almost any definition you can come up with, but they were very tribal boundaries that were more historic or faith-based or whatever, and grassroots politics was driving the response rather than top-down politics. And I think both Brent and Larry were predisposed to say it was much easier when we dealt with the top-down folks. And so there was a predisposition not to get engaged in the tribal warfare that was taking place. And some of it was hot, most of it was not. It was political. And let's let the Europeans deal with it because they understand the tribes better than we do. So I don't want to say that it was those two personalities that probably helped influence the president not to get overly engaged in Yugoslavia, but I suspect that those two personalities did influence the president.
Was there an element of exhaustion? Was there an element of exhaustion?
Well, how much can you carry on your plate? And remember, President George W. Bush had probably more on his plate than any one-term president. He had an awful lot on his plate, including, he was a president, didn't have either house of Congress with him. So he had a lot of challenges just to deal with whatever solution he was offering, whether it was domestic or foreign policy. There was a loud and serious and frequently contrarian echo, and he had to deal with that. At the same time that any first-term president is also focused a little bit on their opportunity to be a two-term president. And that was building over the time, especially when Yugoslavia was starting to implode.
Let me follow up on this just because I think it directly, I agree with everything Andy just said, and I think it touches on something that you were mentioning, David, that here is an area where I think one can really interrogate the constrained limits and the structures that bound Bush's worldview. Because the nation state really is one of those structures. It was very difficult at the end of the Cold War. That the New World Order was all about the United Nations and nation states treating each other well, which is one of the reasons why the war in Iraq fits so nicely for Bush in terms of being able to understand what the United States response should be. Ethnic tension, dare I say terrorism ultimately, was not the prevalent issue in Bush's worldview.
Bill?
Thanks, Jeff. Really enjoyed reading the manuscript. Will Hitchcock here at the Miller Center and the History Department. Before we came in, we had a really nice opportunity to talk with Secretary Card just generally about his experiences as Chief of Staff. And one of the things that you raised in our conversation was just the kaleidoscope of burdens that's on the president at any one time. And I think, Jeff, each of your commentators in different ways, in very sophisticated ways, has brought some attention, some criticism to what you've done so far by suggesting that there is much more on the plate of George H.W. Bush than foreign policy. Of course, that's your subject, that's your focus, but here's my question. I think I know what you're going to say. You have to say this, but I just, for the purposes of a discussion about the methodology that you're pursuing, I want to ask if we really can write a good presidential study, a study of presidential leadership without taking into account domestic politics, congressional relations, economic policy, the legislative agenda that the president is pursuing at the same time that he's trying to end the Cold War, the question of not only public opinion, but the constant changing of public opinion, the pursuit of a second term. These are issues that are not peripheral. They're absolutely fundamental, and I think that they would probably occupy as much time if you went through the clock of a given presidential day as foreign relations does. So obviously you're writing principally on the way President Bush handled foreign policy in the end of the Cold War, but how are you going to figure out a way not to completely, or I guess I should say, how will you find a way to address these criticisms? Because this isn't the first time you're going to hear, this isn't the last time you're going to hear this line of criticism. What about the other half of the job?
Well, this is a problem. To my mind, I think the sacrifice of the domestic is what I have been forced to make, though obviously I need to do a better job of making sure that it's not a complete 100% sacrifice, but the sacrifice of an interrogation of the domestic is what I was forced to make in order to include the international side, because I think one could write a full study of a presidency, domestic and foreign. Something like Eisenhower, for example, would be good.
We do need a new book on
We
Eisenhower.
do need a new book on Eisenhower. I think one could do that, but you would simply not have enough pages, it seems to me. Even with the most generous of editors, you would not have enough pages to also do the same for the international scene. And I think I have a good benefit here in that this was a president who clearly, this was a criticism of him, but I think it's also a criticism that was bounded in truth, who cared significantly, if not primarily, about foreign policy, certainly during major crises. And so to focus on the foreign policy for him makes more sense for Bush than it would for others during this period. But this is a difficulty. In fact, I should just mention, in terms of methodological questions, the evolution of the study. The study originally set out to be full soup to nuts George Bush foreign policy. I had Dalek's book on FDR, for example, as the model. In fact, it's still sitting right above my computer, so I can look. I should take it out because it's no longer the model, but it's a nice paperweight. And it goes basically from A to Z, from 33 to 45, covering all foreign policy issues. And simply two things occurred. First, I realized that the voluminous data that we have for everything around the world was simply going to make a similar study of Bush, if there's going to be an international component, that much more voluminous to the point of perhaps impossible. And secondly, and this I really have to thank my editor for, there was a moment where we were discussing how to square this circle, because I still wanted to do everything. And he said, well, what do you really care about? And I said, I really care about the end of the Cold War. He said, done. Focus on the end of the Cold War. And of course, my conception of the end of the Cold War also involves China, also involves other areas around the world that aren't necessarily always put in the story, which is oftentimes told just of Germany to the east. But even still, I think I'm trying to have a narrative structure that offers the international view and clearly needs to do more on the domestic front. But I don't know that one could do, I could not do without really running into, without really needing a divorce lawyer, probably. I could not do that full synthetic study in less than 2,000, 4,000 pages, and I wouldn't read that.
Can I offer commentary? I actually agree with Jeff on this, although he's done it effectively for one tiny instance with Gorbachev. Gorbachev's visit to the United Nations and his speech there and his popularity in New York City and the crowds coming out, a wonderfully orchestrated public relations tour for America and the world to witness. And it did change the perception of the world about Gorbachev and made him kind of a rallying figure that we could say, hey, he wants to do the right thing. And I guarantee that the General Secretary of the Soviet Union expected that he was going to have ongoing communications plan that would be implemented for probably months. But an earthquake happened in Armenia, and it disrupted his cadence. You'll find thousands of examples for President Bush where there were hurricanes or tornadoes or fires or Lee Atwater dying or his mother getting sick or Kenny Bunkport getting hit by the perfect storm. There were lots of distractions that came in the midst of responsibility. And you could not, there aren't enough volumes to be able to be read by anybody.
Well, including a very personal one. Not only the destruction of the house up in Kenny Bunkport, but also towards the end of the administration, President Bush and Mrs. Bush and the dog all develop a thyroid problem simultaneously.
That's right. That's
yeah,
true.
And this obviously caused the Secret Service much consternation because that's not supposed to happen. That 3 people develop it and 2 people and a dog, and so this really was time consuming to figure out first of all how to regulate the president's health. In fact, he and those around him complained for several months that he was more fatigued than previously as they tried to get the medicine right, but also. You had to inspect the water, and why is the dog sick? And so there's really, that's going to appear, but I don't think I'm going to have a chapter on thyroid. Yeah. So.
Rebecca?
As a follow-on to Jim Hirschberg's...
Who are you?
Oh, sorry. Rebecca Brubaker, one of the Miller Center Fellows from this year. I guess I have a 2-part question. First, Jeff, appreciated your analogy at the beginning of this idea that Bush thought history was flowing in the right direction and his job was more to manage the flow around the rocks rather than diverting it or stopping it. Beyond the 2 times that you mentioned where he, so to speak, dipped his hand in that flow to guide events, was there a third that an omission that he most regretted, where he wished he would have dipped his hand and he hadn't? I would have wondered about Yugoslavia. You've already talked a bit about that. And maybe a related question, was there any point near the end of his presidency that you've run into where he started to question whether that flow really was headed in a better direction as opposed to just a different direction to maybe a more volatile and dangerous in different ways world? Or did the optimism for the direction of the flow always stay with him? I guess is the question.
There was a lot happening in Africa. And the president knew what was happening because he would get reports, that would be reported up, and he would be somewhat frustrated if it was too much to deal with right now. And a Defense Department that was saying, don't look to us. Please do not look to us. I mean, you had big famines. You had disruptive governance. You had the throes of the end of the relationship with the Soviet Union that was the lifeline for some of these governments in Africa. So there was a lot to pay attention to in Africa, and the president was predisposed to want to pay a lot of attention to it. But he had to exercise great discipline and set priority. Because a Jim Baker couldn't be preoccupied with some of these distractions that were not distractions for the people who were hungry, and he would have to send people over to help and make things happen. But there was an awful lot going on. And President Bush, because he had been as probably the best trained president ever, he would bring with him, gosh, I would have been paying a lot of attention to this. I want to know about it. Yes, I got to get involved. I should be there. I should know what's going on. And he did want to know what's going on, but he had to be restrained and say, somebody else is going to have to pay attention to this and give me regular reports. And if it reaches the next threshold, ring my bell.
And I think Somalia is actually a good example where that the president finally does decide, obviously, to do something. And the story which one hears about the president's ultimate decision-making is a very private one about Somalia. And I should caution this by saying I have no documentary evidence for this story. But I've heard it separately and individually from so many different people that it when everybody's telling the same tune, it starts to ring like it's potentially true. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on if you remember this the same or differently. That obviously Somalia is building. This is no surprise to anyone that the famine is going on. The reports of trying to stabilize Somalia have been across the president's desk for months on end. And then ultimately, and this is very, very obviously late in the game for the administration. Ultimately, the president is upstairs watching television. And there are images of starving children, and essentially the announcer says, "Can't somebody do something?" And he says, "I can do something." And more importantly, have a moral imperative to do something. And of course, when he presents the idea of doing something to his national security staff, they say, "What are you, crazy? I mean, that's what's the exit strategy?" And he says, "The exit strategy is feeding children." And I think that's a moment where he discards the Hippocratic, but that's also very, very late in the game. So.
Yeah.
Hi. Does this work? How does this work? Should be. Oh, good. Hi, Dale Copeland, Department of Politics, University of Virginia. Jeff, I'm going to come at you sort of from a political sciencey point of view here, because I've heard a lot of interesting descriptions of what's been happening, but I kind of want a causal story that I want to know where you fit within the causal debates about the end of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. Because as I see it, there are sort of 3 or 4 big ones. There's the sort of straightforward, Gorbachev and the Politburo realized that they were way overspending on military. They had to reduce the military spending or they'd be a defunct great power. Reagan and Bush pushed them to the ground with, their own arms buildup, Star Wars, and so forth. That's the sort of causal story that forced the end of the Cold War, reluctantly on the Soviet Union and very much in the favor of what the U.S. got out of it. A second story is the opposite. It's sort of Gorbachev as a liberal or Gorbachev as a new ideologically different Soviet leader who's got this vision, quasi-liberal vision for how he wants the Soviet Union to change and to become a more integrated part of the world community. Even though he in his memoirs claims he's a Leninist, that's the sort of story. I don't buy it, obviously. The third story that I'm very sympathetic to is that the Soviet regime, even before Gorbachev, but especially under Gorbachev, realized that they needed the trade and technology that the West could offer if they were going to revitalize the economic structure of the Soviet Union and make it a viable superpower into the long term. Military, yes, that was important. You got to reduce the arms spending. But more importantly is to revitalize the economic base of the Soviet Union so that the Soviet Union could indeed become an important player into the 21st century. Otherwise, they felt they would just economically decline and therefore politically and militarily be no longer viable. And I guess the fourth story really is a more personalistic story of personalities, Gorbachev versus Reagan, Gorbachev versus Bush. And I've only read 3 chapters of your manuscript, the ones I saw online. And I sense you're in the fourth camp, but I'm not sure what the causal story is there other than descriptively that they liked each other or they grew to trust one another. The story that a political scientist like myself would want to ask is, what conditions allowed that trust to develop, especially with Reagan, who was very much an anti-Soviet individual. How does that trust develop, and what are the material or ideological or cultural circumstances hanging over these leaders that allow their personalities to play such an important role at this critical time? To me, a descriptive story of just their personalities talking to one another and having trust build doesn't really tell me more what I really want to know, which is what's the causal reasons why they were able to do it, and let's say Kissinger and Nixon, who built up détente, weren't able to do it? Or why wasn't a Carter able to do it, but why were these individuals able to do it? And that's why I extract from the descriptive story to look at the causal conditions under which this would work.
That's a great question. Let me give you 2 initial short responses and a longer one. The first is I've never been prouder not to be a political scientist. The second is it's a narrative approach. You can interpret it how you want. The second is, I don't know why you're uncomfortable with the notion that Ronald Reagan single-handedly did all this. I mean, he pulled the wall. I saw him take his shirt off, pull the wall down. It was all over. But in all seriousness, I think actually the view which I take is a combination of several of the different themes that you've established. But I think there's also, and this is where perhaps we see a disciplinary distinction, there is an element of chaos also that I think is significant at the end. I think of all the players in this story, and this is actually really one of the tensions within the book, that George Bush has got his name on the title, but Gorbachev is really the most important person in all of this. That Gorbachev is the one who recognizes, as do others within the Soviet Union, that the system needs to change. I'm not actually particularly impressed by the idea of importing technology, but rather that they need to open the system up and adopt more Western ways because socialism is not working. And we should never forget that Gorbachev did not want the Soviet Union to end. And importantly, was an avowed socialist. I mean, so he was saying, how can I save the system, not how can I discard the system? That's really quite crucial. And he wanted, I think, to open up the system, to integrate. And ultimately, what's interesting to me is that that his ideas actually do evolve, even during the relatively short time that he's in office. I mean, it's really only 6 years that this all occurs for him. He begins with the notion that we need to change the system and integrate reforms and open things up within the Soviet Union. But I don't think it's until about 1988, in fact, in 89, the UN speech is really the best public indication of this, when he begins to talk about essentially his vision of a new world order. In fact, he uses that phrase, a new world order, which is one in which the Soviet Union is more integrated with the Western Europe. And this is where he begins the rhetoric, which doesn't even appear until June of 1989, of a common European home. And of course, this notion and this rhetoric of a common European home scares the bejesus out of the Americans because they recognize if the Europeans are building a home, we don't have a wing. You know, we're not in it. And they use that architectural metaphor themselves quite frequently to say that this is really the central problem that Gorbachev is posing for us. But then something significant happens. I think Gorbachev is the catalyst, and Gorbachev opens up, whichever metaphor you want. He's a catalyst. He takes the cork out of the bottle. And people begin to run with it. And here's where crowds, I think, do actually play a story in the end of the Cold War, because that Gorbachev never envisioned losing control the way that he did. But significantly, Gorbachev was very adamant that we were not going to use force to reimpose control. and was very explicit with people like Erich Honecker in East Germany that you should not use force, and we will not back you if you use force. And don't forget, we have a lot of Soviet troops on Eastern German soil. So I think the story I would tell is one of a decaying Soviet Union, which almost everybody recognizes, Gorbachev willing to make changes, and then the change speeding up and catalyzing in ways that even he did not predict.
Can I add one thing? It wasn't just President Bush's personality. It was the complementary, with an E, personality of Jim Baker. And so Gorbachev could deal with the president respectfully and infrequently. Jim Baker had a very good relationship with Shevardnadze, and they got along well. And that created a climate that I think encouraged Gorbachev that, hey, this might work. I do think Gorbachev was trying to reform the Soviet Union, not dissolve it. And I think that he ended up being a believer that he could do actually more for his people if he were to have a more open society that would be engaged. And so I think that he became a believer, but I just don't think it would have happened just with the one personality. I think you had to have two personalities at least two personalities on each side. And remember, Jack Matlock, our ambassador, was a cynic. Didn't really think it would work at the beginning. So the president was getting lots of different views, but I think Jim Baker's relationship ended up being very constructive as well.
Well, and here's another case where the personalities and the individual moments really matter, because I think it's crucial. This relationship between Shevardnadze and Baker is quite close, and I think it's crucial that Shevardnadze is not a diplomat. Correct. And doesn't know anything about foreign policy, and comes to Gorbachev when Gorbachev asks him to be foreign minister and says, I don't know anything about foreign policy, and Gorbachev says, exactly, because we're going to do everything different, so you'll approach this all with fresh eyes. And when he begins meeting with Baker, Baker sends these wonderful private communications, not even through the normal channels, private communications to the White House for Bush and Scowcroft and their eyes only, essentially, though I don't know how many other eyes saw them. It says for their eyes only, in which Baker says, you would not believe how honest this guy is being with us, that they are afraid and they don't know where things are going, and that they are afraid of their own public if they don't get reform moving fast enough, and they're also afraid of conservatives if they move too fast. And it's hard to picture somebody who's trained as a diplomat like Molotov demonstrating fear to Baker, but Shevardnadze was open about it. So I think that the personalities really matter there.
Well, what I think is interesting in the way both of you spoke is that you might say the fundamental driving force is what many people have suggested, which is Soviet decline, the decline that in some sense kicked in the late 60s, which Brezhnev and Kosygin understood, got them going into the first détente, and then linkage politics. But then the realization in the early 80s that this was even worse than the 60s, 0% growth, et cetera. And so this growth, the fear of relative decline and the need to integrate the Soviet Union is pushing this Gorbachev to take steps that become more and more radical, including domestic reforms that lead to what you're talking about, this instability by 1989 that wasn't present in 1985 and wasn't even foreseen, of course. And it's 89, of course, Eastern Europe, domestic instability. So what I hear, I think it's a multi-causal story that I'm hearing, but one of the causal factors that I see so forceful in both of your responses is that without this fundamental relative decline and the understanding of the Soviets and the Politburo, not just Gorbachev, that unless we do something big, we aren't going to be a superpower for long, or at least for the next couple of decades. Is that, am I hearing you right, that in some sense that's pushing an avowed Leninist socialist to make what look like liberal reforms, but he's doing it in an instrumental way to overcome this decline problem that's so pervasive?
I actually believe in Gorbachev's peripheral vision, not knowing how to describe it otherwise. You also have a relationship with a Polish pope, calling attention to what has happened in Poland, the Soviet Union. And if you're going to say glasnost and perestroika are taking root in some places within the Soviet Union, and you had Margaret Thatcher with Ronald Reagan shining spotlights that caused others within the Soviet Union to say, wait a minute, so this is not a monolithic Soviet Union Gorbachev game. I think there's a lot of pressure coming from Poland and Czechoslovakia and other places. Václav Havel has written his poems, and things are happening. So, and the Pope is giving permission for it to happen.
Well, and I think, for me, the best way to understand this, with all these different cross currents, as Andy mentioned, is that I think what Gorbachev launched more than anything else is an intellectual revolution within his country. That the moment that you say that we are going to allow not only reform and change, because everybody likes reform and change, but rather reform and change not centralized in Moscow, and reform and change on the factory floor, allows people to begin to question, and that's where things really begin to catalyze, and others throughout Eastern Europe begin to take this and run with it as well. But for me, I think at the heart, it is the explanation that you're describing, which is a recognition of Soviet decline, and then the decision to make not only structural changes, but intellectual changes as well, none of which has anything to do with the United States. Yes, I think if there is one pernicious, evil lie in history which is driving U.S. foreign policy in terrible directions in the 21st century, it's the notion that we spent the Soviets into the ground.
I agree.
Yeah, so anybody who's watching on C-SPAN, we didn't. So.
Frank St. John's University. I think there's a fifth explanation, actually, Gorbachev-centered also for the end of the Cold War. I have two comments and then a question centering on the vision thing and the New World Order. The decline of the Soviet system, I think, was Gorbachev-centered, but if you take a look at his comments, especially retrospective comments on what he thought was going on, he called the end of the Soviet Union, he called the Soviet experiment a dead end in social evolution. I think that's pretty much a direct quote. And what he realized, I think, was that Soviet ideology, as it had played out, had no chance of being realized in a rapidly globalizing world, that the Soviet Union was actually isolating it, and somewhere else, he says that the Soviet Union's foreign policy was setting itself up against the rest of humankind. Okay, so it's a combination of, I think, Gorbachev's true believer faith, and oftentimes true believers are the greatest apostates, that this ideology was going nowhere and had no chance of going anywhere. And on the other side, it's not so much American foreign policy, although that certainly played a role, but the emergence of this global society, which appeared to be irreversible, and Gorbachev admits that, that led him to the decision, well, we can stay outside it or we can join it. And if we have to join it, we have to join it on the world's terms. We have to join the World Bank, we have to join the IMF, we just have to become part of it. The other comment has to do with Mr. Card's interpretation of events in Yugoslavia, which I think some of you may know has been the subject of great debate among historians. Was it in fact tribalism? I think the current historical opinion is running in the opposite direction. That no, it was not tribalism. That in fact it was the politicians who screwed things up. And if the politics of the local leaders, the Europeans, the Americans had been more adroit, that probably this sad episode could have been avoided. So lastly, the vision thing, there's that famous press conference in Cairo in which the president's remarks typically are attributed to jet lag, in which he's asked to define what the New World Order is, and it just comes out a jumble. My question is, how systematically did the administration think about the New World Order, and was in fact its thinking more coherent than was on display in that press conference?
I think the New World Order, in quotation marks, and Gorbachev was the first one to use the term that I'm aware of, but was not.
It actually goes back to the 1920s.
Well, no. I'm talking in this context.
Yeah, I was going to say, it goes back centuries before.
No, but in this context, I don't think that it was contrived. I think it's more describing the result. So I'm not sure that the team at the White House was looking to create a new world order. They were trying to deal with a world that has changed that represented a new world order. So I'm not sure that this was a strategic map of creating a new order. I think if it was a creative map, I think somebody would have been very involved in it, and it might have been John Sununu, who loved to create new solutions for problems that didn't exist. So it was.
At this point, we just have a few minutes left. I want to turn to David and Melanie and see if you'd like to make any additional comments or press Jeff on some aspects of the comments. I think he's responded, for this venue, very, very forthrightly and constructively to your comments, but give you a chance to follow up and have an exchange if you want.
We have a bunch of students writing their dissertations here, and I think one thing that's fun and instructive to think about is the genre problems of putting together a long piece. And you hear Jeff wrestling with some of the genre conventions of writing this kind of work. Is it a presidential biography? Is it an international history? What goes in the page? What doesn't go on the page? And I think trying to do three things at once is something dissertators shouldn't do, probably. There's sort of three arcs to Jeff's story. But it'll be interesting how he weaves them together. I still am worried that by not conceding the degree to which President Bush and his team are wrestling with many issues at once, even if it's just a paragraph here, a sentence there, you're denying your readership the ability to understand the world they faced, which is not a singular linear world that proceeds alphabetically. And so I think it's just...
I think it's a great point. I really do.
And a monograph leads us to write in a more argumented, linear fashion, but you're writing a much broader synthesis, so it's a tricky genre problem, and I'm hearing you still wrestle with that genre.
Yeah, I'd just like to come back to my Middle East question and push you on that a little bit more. What you understand the Bush administration to have gone into the crisis in Iraq expecting or preparing for in terms of U.S. Middle East policy?
There was already some good work done with the new administration on what America's national security aims should be at this point. Richard Haass had a key role in directing and writing much of that, obviously as NSC director for the Middle East. And the argument which came out of those NSC documents was essentially that the United States needs to ensure that there is no singular power that's dominant in the Gulf. And so consequently, Iraq's move south gives the fear that there is actually going to be that dominant power.
And this is dual containment from the 80s as well, right?
Exactly. In fact, one of the interesting things that occurred in that NSC debate, which was only recently declassified, are the number of people, Dick Cheney in particular, who argue in that meeting that, well, maybe it doesn't really matter that Saddam Hussein has gotten all that oil from Kuwait because he's got to sell it, and we want it. So, as long as he's selling on the global market, what's the problem if it's Kuwaiti oil or Iraqi oil? And it's a very convoluted meeting, and people are throwing out ideas, so it's hard to tell what somebody's sincere thought is and what somebody's thought piece is within the meeting. So even at the moment of crisis, people begin to step back and take a look at their assumptions and move forward. I'll tell you, one of the most interesting things that we've discovered in the new documents is just what a raw deal April Glaspie got in all of this. As you may recall, she was the U.S. ambassador to Iraq. She gets called into this is a 30-second version. She gets called into a meeting with Saddam Hussein days before the invasion. This is a very rare thing, by the way. She never U.S. ambassador never gets to talk to Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein doesn't talk to people who then live. And he essentially explains that, we have all these long-standing grievances, and she says essentially, we cannot comment on border disputes. And people have subsequently said, well, that gave him a green light. The truth of the matter is, I have 13 different cables from the White House and from the State Department in the days leading up to that saying, make sure you tell Saddam Hussein we don't comment on border disputes because we don't comment on border disputes. There are 3,000 border disputes around the world that if we commented on every one of them, we'd have to stick our noses in everywhere. And she then delivered the second part of the message, which always gets forgotten, which is we don't comment on border disputes, but we really will be against any use of force. And we are always against use of force. Diplomatic solutions are the way to go. And that part always gets forgotten. So there's any number of cables that say this. In fact, President Bush was scheduled to speak with Saddam Hussein by telephone the evening of the invasion. Of course, the call never occurs. And the talking points that were prepared for him also include that language that we're not going to comment on border disputes. That's the message we're sticking with. Don't use force is the next part. But I think she really gets a raw deal in this. But it really demonstrates that their primary concern, it seems to me, for the Middle East is let's not have this be an issue. Let's make sure that the Middle East is calm enough to get the oil out because the rest of the world is going on. And so as long as we don't have one dominant power in the Middle East, that's all we really care about. I don't see a lot else, actually, in the national security documents of differences with the Reagan administration over the Middle East. So.
Well, I want to thank Jeff for giving us a draft manuscript that has initiated a very rich conversation. And I want to thank the panelists for taking advantage of the opportunities in that manuscript to really conduct this terrific discussion about writing presidential history and about the administration of H.W. Bush. Thanks very much.
I'm deeply grateful. Thank you.